Good afternoon. It's just after 2:30 on March 18th, and we are here as the Planning, Housing, and Parks Committee. We have two items on today's agenda, starting with Agricultural Land Preservation Easements, recommended FY25-30 CIP. Welcome to our guests from the Office of Agriculture, from the Executive Branch, and Council staff. Let me turn it over to Council staff to take us through this item and to call on our guests as needed.
Sounds good. Good afternoon. This is the Ag Land Preservation Easements recommended CIP item, as you referenced. This is an item that is funded by non-general fund revenues, specifically the agricultural transfer tax, developer payments in the form of building lot terminations, and investment income that the balance accrues. Those three revenues, as they are estimated or projected to increase, continue to support acquisition of agricultural land for preservation and easements. So with the projection of those revenues increasing as part of this FY25-30 recommended CIP, the expenditures increase correspondingly. And so for more questions about the program itself, we have representatives from the Office of Agriculture and OMB to answer any questions.
Great. Thank you. Well, this committee and the predecessor of this committee has demonstrated its commitment to ag land preservation in a significant way and trying to improve the way that we are dealing with these issues to make sure that we aren't siphoning off funds intended for ag land preservation for other uses within the operating budget and otherwise. It was a practice that was done for fiscal reasons during the depths of the recession. And something that we felt like was no longer necessary or appropriate based on a changing fiscal climate. So I wanted to note that and appreciate that and just thank the small but mighty Office of Agriculture for all of the work that you do each and every day to protect and preserve the agricultural heritage of Montgomery County, but also the economic opportunities that we have in the agricultural community, 1/3 of the county's landmass. So with that, any additional comments from the Office of Agriculture?
Mike Shuffle for the record, Office of Ag. I want to say thank you to the Planning, Housing, Parks Committee and the predecessor of FED. You all have always been highly supportive of our efforts, so thank you, and thank you for getting the non-ag pres cost into the operating fund. That was very helpful. Thank you, Paul and Pam. Thank you, Veronica and Natasha, for helping us putting this very straightforward budget together. So thank you.
Great. Councilmember Jawanda.
Good to see you. I think, is this your first time before us and with the full weight of the office behind you? And so congratulations. You even adopted the cadence of your predecessor. And so not sure if that's on purpose or not, but yeah, always a great bang for your buck here and appreciate the work that you all are doing. So.
Councilmember Fanny Gonzalez.
I just want to echo what Councilmember Jawando mentioned and also say thank you once again for all your work last week, taking us to Loudoun County to check out the rural areas over there. It was a fabulous trip because your office made it happen, so thank you for that.
Thank you. We have a couple people in new roles here. Bilal overseeing this part of the CIP before this committee, so welcome and appreciate your work as well, joining Ms. Dunn, and welcome to the Executive Branch. So it is a very straightforward request. I think we've done the heavy lifting previously at this committee. Fortunately, to make this easy, the Executive Branch is going to take yes for an answer, which we appreciate, as will the Office of Agriculture. So without objection and with strong support for this program, we will approve this 3-0. Okay? Thank you.
Thank you.
May they all be that straightforward and easy, right? All right, now we're going to call up our guests from the Planning Department and the Chair of the Planning Board, Mr. Harris. And we're going to have a conversation that follows up on the prior conversations that this committee has had based on a focus and an emphasis that I had outlined when I became chair of this committee to establish housing targets and to take the Council of Governments housing targets that we have committed to, that the prior council committed to under the leadership of Nancy Navarro when she was council president, that we've all signed on to a more specific and granular level, so we can actually hold ourselves accountable to the commitments that we have made, and to understand what we're actually achieving and what we're not achieving, and how we can make up for the difference and the gap. It's always a balance in these issues of understanding what the market is going to do without any intervention, and what interventions we have to do, both in public subsidies for affordable housing, for changes to zoning policy, and all the other various aspects that we do to facilitate housing, not just how much housing we want, but where we want it at the price levels that we know we need it. So really appreciate all the work that has gone into this. Appreciate your work, Mr. Sartori, in your current role, but also in your previous role, where you were working quite a bit on these issues. And of course, our resident housing expert, Ms. Gavoni, for all of your expertise and your issues. It's been great to go on the road with you, so to speak, and start to talk about some of these issues and explain it to external stakeholders out in the public, and for me to lay things out and then turn it over to an actual expert like you to explain it. I'll just say that I appreciate where we're headed with this. I think when we set this out, the goal was always a target, but also a benchmark. There was kind of two dual purposes here. And, I think we're honing in on that today with recommendation of, how do we assess where we are in terms of 2030 and the commitments that we have already made, and where that's happening, how close we are to making it happen, and what, the benchmark is showing of where we're at, recognizing that there's only so much we can do in that short a time frame at the policy level to change the outcome before 2030, but then really looking to 2040 and 2050 and understanding, okay, why don't we set our own targets, which no other local jurisdiction has done up to this point, and start thinking today about not only benchmarking where we are to 2030, but thinking through for 2040 and 2050, what are the policy changes we should be thinking about, what is the priorities that we should have in order to get to where we want to go, because really 2040 planning, as we know, starts now. And then the other piece of it is this question and balance when you talk about the market versus the policy, how to balance between master planned and pipeline. And to me, ultimately, the pipeline is what the market is essentially doing without our additional intervention. And master plan is what we intended for things to do, which doesn't always come to fruition, but that should reflect our priorities and should reflect the type of growth where and how we want it at a community by community basis, and try to figure out and hone in on how do we set metrics and how do we set a formula and an algorithm here that reflects both, and how to look at things differently, where I think the pipeline is something that is very appropriate for 2030, but not necessarily for 2040 and 2050. So I just wanted to lay that out. It reflects the conversations that we've had previously. As colleagues will recall, and the public may recall who tuned in, previously the planning department provided us with their initial draft of what this could look like. This committee gave robust feedback and comments on tweaks to that, and asked the planning department to take a look at that. The planning board has subsequently weighed in with a separate set of lenses and a view of it, and ultimately the three different options don't have huge changes in terms of the outcome of where they go, but there are three different ways to look at it, and I think that's something for us to take up. So really would love to turn it over. I know there's a presentation that planning is going to present to us, but I think the decision points are going to be, what do we do with the algorithm for 2030 as we have set out that we previously discussed? Are we interested in moving forward with a longer term horizon and begin the discussion for what that might look like, although I don't think we're going to develop the formula for what the out years, out decades look like today. We can set the strategic direction for that being where we'd like to go, and start talking about what are the different puts and takes, and what do we want to weight in what ways at a high level, and then come back on the out year conversation. But want to make sure that we have the agreement of the committee that that is an approach that is agreed upon here. So with that, unless colleagues have any initial introductory comments, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Scavone and Mr. Sartori, Ms. Dunn, Ms. Scavone, whoever else wants to speak, and then Ms. Scavone will take us through the presentation.
Sure.
But Mr. Sartori, you want to kick us off?
Absolutely. Thank you for the record, Jason Sartori, Director of Planning for Montgomery County. And actually, I have to say, I mean, that was quite an excellent summary of what we've got going on before you today. In fact, we could probably skip the presentation, though we will go through it. So we're here, obviously, to update you on our efforts on the local housing targets. And we hope that we can get some approval from the committee on the methodology that we'll use to set those targets. Since the last time we met, which I think was last summer on this, we've done a bunch of work. First, we worked with our partners at DPS to get a clearer understanding of the number of units that have been permitted, that have been built or permitted so far this decade. So in 2020, 21, 22, and 23, and we're confident in that number now. The next thing we did was we made a concerted effort to better understand our current pipeline, and subsequently to consider what potential role the unbuilt pipeline should play in setting the local housing targets. After that, we modified our recommended methodology for setting the 2030 local housing targets in a way that we think appropriately balances the things that President Friedson talked about, the expectations from the current pipeline with policy guidance and with our vision for future development. We believe that this approach makes it more likely that we'll actually achieve the targets too. And then lastly, we prepared a method for setting and allocating housing targets for 2040 and 2050. So we'll walk through some recommendations of how to do that, but ultimately we'll follow your lead in where you want to go with this. But these longer term targets place a greater emphasis on our vision for the future growth patterns, and they're much more aspirational in nature. So as you know, this is a highly data intensive effort. For me, as President Friedson kind of acknowledged, this is kind of the last vestige of the old Jason, if you will. As planning director, I can't possibly be as intimately involved in guiding detailed analyses as I have been with this recently, and I'm sure my colleagues here, as well as back in Wheaton, are probably emitting a sigh of relief in hearing me say this. But this effort is a holdover for me from my time as chief of our countywide planning and policy division, and so I felt the need to be involved as we've prepared the recommendations for you today. As I mentioned, we are hoping to get your consensus today on the methodology so we can finalize a set of local housing targets for 2030, 2040, and 2050. What we are not doing today is identifying all of the tools and policies that will help get us there. There will be plenty of time for that, and it will be a continuous effort as we go forward once these are set. It's our hope, though, that we reference these targets regularly, frequently, as we use them to guide future policy decisions as well as master plan recommendations. But again, I want to emphasize that this is data intensive. It might seem complicated, but there is a logical progression here, and at the end we do get a set of numbers. And we will walk through each step of the methodology and our recommendations. Because each step builds upon the previous, it's important to know that we have adequately explained each step. And so we'd kind of like to treat this less as a briefing and a presentation and more of a working session where, I encourage you to stop us, ask questions. I know you've done that before. Really encourage you to stop us, ask questions, and let us know if there's anything that we present that's unclear. The fact is 2030 is just 6 years away, less than 6 years at this point, and we have a lot of new units to build before then. We should move forward without further delay. Setting appropriate local housing targets that are both aspirational and realistic was the goal of our effort, and we believe that this is a vital next step in solving our housing crisis. And so, in the spirit of moving forward without delay, I'll ask Lisa to continue.
Thank you, Director Sartori. Good afternoon, Lisa Gavone, Housing Planner with the Planning Department. So just a very quick, brief reminder of why we're here. In 2019, the County Council signed on to ambitious COG housing goals through a resolution, and that essentially called on the county to produce 31,000 units by 2030. The local housing targets, as Director Sartori said, the projects we hope set realistic and achievable local housing targets for the 22 planning areas in Montgomery County. And the project also allows us to contextualize and better understand the housing shortage at a hyper-local level and to drive those strategies to help meet the housing goals. So this graph shows our progress to date. The blue bars are the net new number of units that have been permitted in the first 4 years of the decade. The orange bars show the average number of units that we need to permit each of the next 6 years to hit that countywide goal of 31,000 by 2030. And I want to emphasize that the building permit numbers, that blue numbers, they represent net new units. So what I did, if there was a demolition for a single-family detached unit, I took that out. If there was a demolition for a multifamily low-rise building that had 50 but permitted for 20, I counted 150, just to get a more accurate representation of where we are. So to get to the point, we've permitted 9,535 units from 2020 to 23, and that puts us about 2,900 permits behind of a pace of where we need to be of 12,400. And since this effort is about allocating the remaining targets to local planning areas and setting localized housing targets, this is how those 9,935 units that have been permitted so far this decade across the 22 planning areas. I think it's pretty obvious that Bethesda Chevy Chase, nearly 30% of the permits have been there, which is amazing and great. That really shows us how the vision of the Bethesda downtown plan is shaping up. But I also want to emphasize that when we talk about housing goals, places like Clarksburg, Gaithersburg, Germantown, more mid-county and up-county places, they're also doing their part. And that's where we're seeing a lot of more home ownership opportunities, a lot more affordable home ownership opportunities in down county. And it really sets the notion that every single planning area in the county has a goal and has a part in this project. So just to quickly summarize that, we permitted 9,535, we're 2,865 under where we need to be, and we need to permit or build 21,465 units by 2030 to meet the county goal, and that the building permits represent net new units. So just quickly, I'd like to walk through this chart to show you where we are. So, you know, we have an adjusted housing-wide target of 31,000 units. We've already permitted 9,535, so that means that we need to allocate 21,465 to the planning areas. And the methodologies that we're going to discuss today, they represent 5 different index factors. The first is the Thrive Montgomery 2050 growth area, and that's that share of the planning area within that corridor focused growth area and the limited growth areas in the Thrive map. There's also a household forecast part of the index, which is our share of household forecast from COG round 10. And then our zone residential capacity, which is our share of the total county's residential capacity, which really reflects the growth vision established in many of our master plans. And then there's activity center density, which is weight given to planning areas with large and medium Thrive activity centers. And then finally, that premium factor, which is extra weight given to planning areas that are in the corridor focused growth area, but have not historically produced a lot of housing. So just kind of briefly walking through the weighting options, I'll focus on the errors. So the original planning staff recommendation kind of had a weight of 30, 30, 30 for Thrive growth area, the household forecast, and that zone residential capacity score, with 5 points to each the activity center density score and the premium score. The PHP alternative number 1 increased that activity center density score to 10 index points, increasing the total maximum value to 105. And then alternative 2 decreased the Thrive growth area score from 30 to 25 and the zone residential capacity from 30 to 25, but increased the activity center density score and the premium score both to 10. And finally, after we met, we briefed the planning board on the local housing targets project, and they recommended this, the alternative number 3, which would increase the Thrive growth area to 35, the household forecast to 20, and the zone residential capacity index score to 35. So these are the weighting options and how they look. The one thing that you'll probably notice, and we'll look at this in chart form next, is that there's not a lot of variation, as President Friedgen noticed. If we display this on the maps, and we did map it out, you wouldn't really be able to see the variation. So we have it. This chart illustrates that point. It shows for each planning area the range between the minimum target under the 4 options shown in the light blue and the maximum target for the 4 options. Note that it varies across planning areas which weighting option generates the minimum and which generates the maximum. This is only intended to show the range, which is, quite minimal. In fact, the largest change from the original weighting option shown in red dots is the Bethesda Chevy Chase planning area under the planning board option, which is about 200. And to the extent that we use the weighting methodology for the 2030 targets, we are continuing to recommend using our original methodology. We think that it strikes an appropriate balance in targeting housing growth in historically underserved areas, as well as those that have been traditionally identified as growth areas. The second takeaway from these results is that these are great targets. They represent our desired growth patterns captured largely through our general plan, but they are not terribly realistic given the existing conditions, the current pipeline, and the limited amount of time between now and 2030. And so to explain our thinking a little bit more on that, we wanted to talk about the development pipeline. And the development pipeline, it's an inventory of development projects that currently have valid approvals by the planning board but are not completely built. We believe the current pipeline represents the county's most significant contributor to whether we achieve our local housing targets in the next 6 years. As a result, we recommend modifying our approach in setting the 2030 local targets to capture the potential impact of the current unbuilt pipeline. And this is really because our first conversation we had on this, Councilmember Giwando brought up the pipeline and how important that tool is to meet our goals. And we agree. Since that time, we've been doing a lot of work of cleaning up the pipeline, better understanding what projects are in there, how long they've been there, and just understanding project conditions, but we still have a lot of work to do because there's a lot of units in the pipeline. And this is a graph that shows the current pipeline. The pipeline has, 43,000 approved units in it. While this is true, many of those have been built or they've been permitted for building. Many larger projects are permitted in phases. For example, you can have a project in the pipeline that has 200 approved units, but maybe 70 haven't already been built, so that project has 130 unbuilt units in the pipeline. And a project remains in the pipeline until it's completely built or approved or its validity expires. And so, like I said, the current unbuilt pipeline includes about 30,000 units. Again, these units are approved and they're ready to go, and they are our best shot at meeting our short-term goals. While we were also continually adding to the pipeline as the board approves projects on a weekly basis, and the graph shows how the current unbuilt pipeline is distributed across planning areas. So this gets back to that point that that takeaway that we were showing. It's from the results of the 4 weighting options and whether they are realistic. This graph overlays in a red outline the original weighting option to allocate the targets over the current unbuilt pipeline. And when we looked at this, we had some thoughts. One, does it make sense to set relatively low targets in places like North Bethesda, Silver Spring, and Clarksburg, when each of these areas has approved projects that far exceed the targets? On the other end of the spectrum, does it make sense to have 6-year targets for places like Kent Mill, Aspen Hill, Tacoma Park that currently have very little unbuilt pipeline? And then we also thought of what policies can we pursue that can implement in short order that would make it possible for these areas to achieve these targets over the next 6 years. And so, but as you know, those policies will take time to identify, develop, adopt, and implement, but we believe that we're up to the task. And just, one example from this is the Tacoma Park Minor Master Plan is on the verge of being approved, where we have to get through the sectional map amendment. If it allows for about 3,500 units, it would require basically almost 70% build out in 6 years to achieve the housing target in Tacoma Park. But, I do want to be clear, we don't think the pipeline alone is going to be used and should be used solely to set our local housing targets. We know that pipeline is not a guarantee of converted into real units. We need housing. We need to continue to build housing. We need to continue to zone for housing because the pipeline cannot be a guarantee that these units will come. So to better understand this, we looked at the 2018 pipeline and the current 2024 pipeline to study historical rates of converting pipeline projects to built projects. We found that over 6 years, the rate of converting unbuilt pipeline to built pipelines, it varied by planning area. For instance, in North Bethesda, only 15% of the unbuilt units in the pipeline were in January of 2018 were built by January 2024. But Clarksburg, Potomac, Damascus, and Javilla all had rates over 80%. Bethesda Chevy Chase was near 80% at 78%. And then countywide, 51% of the 2018 pipeline was built or permitted by 2024. And I want to say this about North Bethesda's rate because I know it is really low. There are a lot of projects in North Bethesda that have moved forward. They've had 1,000 building permits since 2000. There's a lot of big projects in North Bethesda that take time to move. And there are big projects that were approved after 2018 that are moving, like Strathmore Square. But because we're using those small planning areas, sometimes the rates were heavily influenced by big projects. Another example would be Silver Spring, where the Blairs has a lot of unbuilt units. They built some, but the project seems to have been stalled otherwise. And then in Glenmont Metro Center has built some, but there's still 1,000 unbuilt units there. So using the last 6 years as a proxy, we decided to estimate the anticipated number of current 2024 unbuilt pipeline that will be built in each planning area over the next 6 years. This chart illustrates the conversion rates that we use for each planning area. For 10 of the planning areas, we used the countywide rate because they didn't have enough projects or units to really estimate the conversion rate. And we are recommending that using counts in the last column here as part A of setting the 2030 local housing targets for the 22 planning areas. We also recommend that one of the outcomes of this effort can be to figure out the impediments to getting projects to move. And if we focus on that, it's possible that we may achieve larger impacts from the pipeline toward the local housing targets in some of these areas like North Bethesda or Silver Spring. So one of the policy decisions that we do have to discuss today is whether we should stick with the current historical rates of conversion or to estimate the number of units to result from the current pipeline or adjust it to set alternate expectations. Like if we think that we're going to work with the developers to figure out the impediments, can we get these conversion rates up? Is it realistic to think that only 15% of North Bethesda projects are going to convert in the future? And so so let's go back to the early countywide target for a second. This table shows earlier what we demonstrated calculating a remaining countywide target of 21,465, and that we have an anticipated unbuilt pipeline conversion using those factors of we have an anticipated unbuilt pipeline conversion of, we would predict that 13,448 units will be built from the pipeline, which means that we have about 8,000 units that were our remaining target that we need to allocate towards the planning areas. And when we apply the original weighting to the 8,017 units, we get allocations that you see in the third column here. So we see this as part B of setting the local housing targets. When you combine part A, the expected contribution from the unbuilt pipeline, with part B, the allocation based on index weightings that we originally discussed, you get the 2030 local housing targets for each of the 22 planning areas as shown in the last column. And then this is a graph to just show what that Part A and Part B look like. In the lighter blue, you see that expected 2030 build from the pipeline, and Part B is the darker blue, which is the index allocation. And then this is a comparison on the 2030 approach. You can see that placing an emphasis on the pipeline and where the pipeline is has an impact on the recommendation. The lighter blue is the original weighting option, which you see is more equal amongst the planning areas, but we think that the planning recommendation with a portion of the pipeline sets realistic goals based on the units in the pipeline. And then we'll jump right into setting 2040 and 2050. Wait, sorry.
Yeah, I think it's a good idea to
Yeah.
pause here. Let's digest this.
Yeah.
I mean,
Sure.
There's basically two outstanding items here. One is, of the three options or an alternative that we could develop a combination of those three options, which I would say the staff recommendation, the planning staff recommendation, the committee recommendation, and the planning board recommendation. Those are option A, option B, option C. Again, not huge differences in terms of outcome, but there are different weighting which reflect different priorities and perhaps realities. So I think we should discuss that, number one. And then number two is how the pipeline factors into this, and discuss that, because I have some thoughts on that. I'm sure colleagues do as well. Could you just explain, so obviously we could go through and explain the difference of this, but explain how you would be using the unbuilt pipeline and what impact that would have. Like, I just think that needs to be clear, and then we'll start this
Sure.
conversation.
So we would be using the unbuilt pipeline as, we would take the unbuilt pipeline and apply a conversion rate to that of what we anticipate the build would be by 2030.
And just so we're clear, I just want to make sure we're saying this. So that is what you anticipate will happen
Yes.
moving forward.
Yes, based on historical conversion rate, this is what we anticipate to be built.
And just to keep in a little bit of context here too, we look back 6 years because we need to look forward 6
Sure,
years, right?
sure.
And think about though what's happened over those 6 years. Over the last 6 years, we've had construction costs increase, we had supply issues, we had the pandemic. So we had a number of things that influenced these what we've been calling conversion rates, conversion of unbuilt pipeline into real units. But at the same time, there are complicating issues looking forward too. We have high inflation, construction costs are still high, so there are a number of things that could keep these conversion rates
Yeah,
deflated.
the challenge is, I mean, that's a macro. I mean, and macro is real, but so
Yep.
is micro. So
Yep.
the idea that the last 6 years, when things weren't mass produced, like Bethesda, Chevy Chase would be viewed over the next 6 years equally to Tacoma Park in terms of looking back at the last 6 years. There's some real questions about that, because one's coming out of a master plan. Silver Spring is just coming out of a master plan. The hope is that Silver Spring will see some of the benefits that Bethesda Chevy Chase has, a high-intensity transit-served job center, that was recently, zoned with significant capacity. So there's the macro that you've mentioned that maybe smooths out over time to a certain degree, but there are major micro differences. Ms. Gamoni, did you have anything to add? And then I'm going to turn to colleagues.
I think we would agree with that. I mean, we can look at this conversion rate chart and see that Bethesda Chevy Chase is 78% and North Bethesda is 15%. There's obviously issues on localized level that we would need to explore and figure out how to get those rates up, or even how to get those pipeline units built.
Yeah, I would send the caution out like you do in any financial instrument that you've ever been part of that's in the market, which is past performance does not dictate future success.
Yes.
And, that goes both ways, the good and the bad on this. I would hate for us to go too heavily banking on past performance, I think that's where people get burned. That's true in the financial markets, but I also think it's true in the housing market and the development market, that if we were to expect, what happened over the last 6 years to happen over the next 6 years, and, for that to be the factor that we're heavily weighting here, I think sets us up for unrealistic expectations that are divorced from reality of what we should reasonably expect.
But if you don't mind,
Please.
Artie Harris, Planning Board Chair, but I think staff baked in both conservative and so on North Bethesda, they're saying 18%, and it's very, very low, right? It's not, they're not doing a 51% on average everything. So I think there are, but I think it's not they're going very high on some and very, but it's, I think it's a good start. And what I also thought, Ms. Giavone said, like North Bethesda, it'd be great to talk to get some data feedback from some of the developers. Why isn't your project? So should we keep 18%? Should it be higher? So I mean, talk to some of the. So I think that's important too. And you said there's no past doesn't indicate future, but the purple line is going to come on. In 3 years. And that.
Hopefully not with air quotes, but
yeah. But I mean, there's some intangibles there, but there is always some intangibles. So I think this is a great first start. The planning staff did a great job. They're doing analysis. And one last thing, I think is also Councilman Joando, not only analyzing the existing pipeline was important, which they did, and also it helps. The county exec was always saying, well, we got this big pipeline in there, and so we could also show here we analyzed that pipeline. Right, and by looking at what happened over the last 6 years to predict what's going to happen in the future, we're not going to build it all, but you can count for some of it, and we did count for that. So I don't know, I'm answering your question there, but I think it's a great first try, and I think there's always going to be either way you could go, but I think it's a great first try.
Yeah, what I would just add is one additional thing that we did, and I say we, I'm really being really liberal with that. It was Ms. Giavone, met with each of our, the regulatory teams from each of our area teams to get a sense of, here are all the projects in your area, which of these do you think are going to move forward in the next 6 years? And they had different levels of confidence in each of them, and in some cases they were maybe a little more optimistic and less optimistic too. So I think we feel pretty good with these as setting a proxy for what might come out of the pipeline to potentially go towards setting a target. The one exception to that is that North Bethesda. At 15%, that's quite low, and there are over 10,000 units in the pipeline right now, unbuilt, in North Bethesda. To think that we're only going to get 1,500 of those in the next 6 years, because that's what we saw before, it doesn't seem realistic. I think that, and based on what we heard from our Mid-County regulatory staff, development review staff, we think that that's actually going to be a higher share there. So if you wanted to, you could tweak these just to, again, we're just setting a proxy of how much we estimate to come out of the pipeline to go towards these targets.
And just to be clear, the countywide pipeline conversion is being used at 45%. Is what it says here, but the way that it was framed earlier and
just the ones that are
asterisk,
asterisk.
Case by case.
So
just the asterisk.
Right, the ones that are asterisk, and you'll see it says 51% for those. That's because the countywide conversion rate for over the last 6 years was 51%. The 45% is when you apply all of these rates to each of the pipeline in each of these areas, it comes out to only be 45% of the current pipeline that we're estimating, because we've got a low share. We've got 10,000 units in the pipeline, and we're only applying at 15%, so that brings the average from here down to 45%. But the countywide average over the last 6 years is actually 51%, and that's what we applied to the 10 planning areas that have the asterisk.
All right, my last question, I'm going to turn to colleagues. So is your goal here just to determine, I've started to rethink what the 2030 housing targets should be. I mean, to me, it's more of a benchmark than anything else. So I'm the one who had this idea. I'm the one who asked us to do it, and I appreciate the indulgence of colleagues and the planning department for all the incredible work that you've done, the significant amount of input that colleagues provided at the previous session in July, I believe it was. But really, the benchmark is a different standard. Then the targets would be 24 and 50, which is really, what are our aspirational goals of where we think we need to go in terms of housing moving forward, where we could start today with planning and policy changes and other aspects to figure out, you know, what that looks like and how do we actually move the ball forward in the master planning process, among other, you know, policy changes potentially. I mean, is that because this is very self-reinforcing of things aren't moving as much as we would like in a place like North Bethesda. They're going exceedingly well in a place like Bethesda Chevy Chase. We're going to double down on that concept, maybe triple down on that concept based on what's being presented here. So I just want to get a sense of, like, is that the approach that you are moving towards, that this is more of a benchmark of what we think is going to happen, not necessarily what we're hoping or aspiring to happen?
Right. I don't think, I mean, it could be done in that way. By taking this and just saying that this is only part A of setting that 2030 target, part B still takes the remaining, that this we don't think will, that the pipeline we don't think is going to cover, we still allocate that using the methodology that we had identified previously. So, you know, there's still some aspirational aspect to it. It's not just here's what we think will happen. But even this also provides some potential policy implications, right? So if you wanted to just go with this, you could say, well, what is it that's causing only 15% of the units to be converted in from the pipeline in North Bethesda, and what potential policy could be focused in on that area to make the 10,000 units there now move?
Yeah, but you don't, I mean, it's helpful to have this, certainly, but you don't need to include that in the weighting in order to do what you just said. I mean, those are two different things. One is to analyze this, which you've done some great analysis here, which is super helpful for us to think through those things. The other is to have a formula that determines, you know, what our benchmark is and where we're heading. I'm just a little bit concerned about the idea that we're looking back in a finite 6 years. Those 6 years are unique in many ways, and we're assuming that the next 6 years in every part of the county are going to look almost exactly like the last 6 years, which seems highly unrealistic to me. I mean, I appreciate all the work that's been done. I'm just wondering whether or not we should, if we're going to wait to pipeline, that we look at the countywide pipeline number, either 45% or 51%, and use that, which is smooths out some of those huge fluctuations that are hyper-focused coming out of a master plan, not master planned, you know, for 15 years and maybe waiting for a new master plan. You know, projects in certain areas get held up if there's a new master plan coming. If you know a new master plan is likely to be coming, it's in the work program 2 years from now, you probably are going to hold off until you see what happens. So I just, not taking that into account seems odd to me.
So so what's on the screen now shows you, based on our current recommendations, what portion of the number that would be set for 2030 for each one comes from that part A, the pipeline expectation. You know, if we went with the county-wide rate of 51%, a place like Bethesda, Chevy Chase, Clarksburg, areas where we do see a pretty high conversion rate, you know, where these units do become real units, you know, that will be a much lower target. And that's fine. We could, and it ends up getting reallocated elsewhere. More of it may get allocated through the index. You know, but just to remind you that we do have over 6,000 units right now in the pipeline in Bethesda, and we have an 80%, close to 80% conversion rate there. So we're pretty confident that over the next 6 years we'll probably achieve that too, because you know, if I know past performance.
Yeah, I'm concerned that past performance again,
right.
But the other is, trust me, if Bethesda gets all 6,000 of those units, no one would be happier than I would be, for a lot of reasons. And I know that's a controversial position in some circles, but that is how I personally feel. I feel very strongly about it as a Bethesda resident, not least of which as the council member represents that area. But it also sets up the belief, which is the opposite of the direction I was hoping we were going to go in this, is that Bethesda Chevy Chase is going to take on a disproportionate share, and not that the housing targets that we need are really shared countywide. We have housing needs in every community, and to lean on one part of the county, one, I think is risky, because if something happens and the market does change in that area, we put all of our eggs, or a lot of our eggs, in that basket. And secondly, there is a question at a certain point of, based on land values and rents and, job opportunities, whether at some point there is a diminishing return and other parts of the county become more attractive based on where that breaking point is between, rents and land values and construction costs, et cetera. So I just don't think it's, I think it's a dangerous game if we're, setting up a scenario where we're assuming the past dictates the future, number one, and number two, where we're, potentially putting too many of our, housing eggs in this sense in one basket, as opposed to saying, our housing needs are countywide needs that are in every community, and everybody in every community needs to be part of it. I think that, sets us up for a challenging dynamic moving forward.
Yeah, I see where you're going there. Yes, you could use this average amount, which it would change where it goes, but as if I see where you go. But at the end of the day, the total number of units will likely, whether it's 45 or 50, 51, they'll be about the same. It's just where they're happening, and I understand that. And maybe it's you don't want to show up where you're thinking they're all coming from Bethesda or they're all coming from this. But I think on average we'll get that, based on what we know about the pipeline, we'll get that amount, and maybe in different locations.
Yeah, no, I appreciate it. And I don't think anybody is arguing that the total number of housing units that are needed. I think the question is, I'm a little bit afraid we walk out doing what you're suggesting here, and there's a view of, well, Bethesda is doing gangbusters in terms of housing, and so we don't really have to do a whole lot, and we'll come close to hitting our goal because Bethesda is doing so well, and in terms of housing production. And I just don't think that is the direction that I think we ought to be going, and I don't think that's reflective of the reality on the ground of where our housing needs are. So that's why I think smoothing it out and saying it's countywide and base it off that number allows the pipeline to be included, which seems reasonable to me to benchmark, maybe not to policy, project, and is a little bit, smooths it out a little bit more countywide. But let me turn to Councilmember Jawando first, then Councilmember Funny Gonzalez.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate the effort and the work, and it's always nice to be sitting up here when you ask for something to be done, and it's done, not only done, but it's done in a robust fashion. So really appreciate that. And I think a couple points I want to make. Chair Harris, you mentioned this. We've heard in the ether here discussion of the pipeline from the county executive, and then obviously we had a really in-depth conversation here. Then we have the reality of what the pipeline is, which you've dug into in a deep way here, and how it's performed over time. And I do think this is a really critical component of not only setting targets, but seeing what's realistic. Like, what is the market doing, right? And, look, we all know sitting here that there's a reason the Bethesda Chevy Chase bar is so big. It's performing at 80% because there's desire to live there, and obviously it's fulfilling the master plan that was done prior to my arrival, and that there's high conversion, and you can also demand higher prices there. So I mean, there's a reason the market is building there, and so I do think it's both realistic and appropriate to look within these subgroups. And I agree with you in the North Bethesda case. There's always going to be a couple quirky things here based on that you have to take in micro level data to update this. I do think there should be that flexibility, but I think when you look at the 6-year as a marker, again, like this is nothing. There's not an exact science. I mean, so we'll say that, and but I do think to say, where have you requested and gotten approval? Let's just define pipeline. It's where you've requested and been approved for, right, at least preliminarily, to build, right? And people have done that because they think there's a whole bunch of reasons in the market. And then when you look at where is being built over time, that should be factored in. So I do think very appreciative of the analysis. I do think it makes sense to have it be local and not just use the county-wide. We're so different, as you know. I mean, these areas are so different, as far as capacity, geography, go down the list of every fee, PHY. There's a lot of differences because we're so big in density levels. And I actually when I saw this chart, I was actually pleasantly surprised, to your point, Ms. Scavone, that there are other areas of the county that are more affordable, like Gaithersburg and Germantown, where there was zone capacity, and where we will be able to take that into even parts of Silver Spring and White Oak, for example, as a kind of farther out in East County, where they're going to have to. People are going to have to do some work here, and it's not just going to all be in one place. So, again, no perfect science here, but I do think that it's helpful. I guess one of the questions I had, in addition to making those points, was I would love to follow up with the age and get more information of the age of approval. How stale are some of these? And let me just ask, did you factor that into this conversion rate at all?
It's not factored into the conversion rate, but we have done analysis related to that. That was one of the first things that we started. There are a lot of old approvals in there that have been sitting there for quite some time that we don't think are going to move, and we'd be happy to share that analysis with you.
Yeah, I'd love to see it. I mean, just to the point of, I don't want to use something that is no longer relevant in the goal, right? So if there was a way to factor that in some way, but again, this is not going to be an exact science. And I think the fact that you're doing Part A and you're looking at the pipeline, but then you're also looking at the allocation in Part B, that makes me even more comfortable with it, because you're putting two forms of analysis together to get to the goals, and everyone's got something to do, and we could always revisit these. The other question I was going to ask was the 8,000. So this number, this chart, when you add it all up, what's that relationship to the 8,000 that are left to build? Could you just restate that?
So if you add up all of these bars, that will get you the 21,465, I think is the number that is remaining to be built to hit the 2030 target. The dark blue, if you summed up just the dark blue, that's the 8,000.
Okay, I just want to make sure. So that's the part that we cannot get through with just the pipeline.
We're assuming that,
right? Yeah. And then, how did you base the shares of the blue? How did you get there again? Just restate that.
The dark blue, that was allocated using the original weighting methodology that we had recommended with the 30, 30, 30, 5, 5.
Yeah. Column.
Yep.
Okay, got it. Because we spent a lot of time last time talking about that a little bit too. And I appreciate your pointing out that whatever we do, none of those really changes that blue line that much, right?
Those didn't. The distinctions between those different alternatives didn't change that dark blue, wouldn't change the dark blue all that much. It's adding in the pipeline piece that really did shift these.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So, and I just want to say, I think that's a good thing. I think it's related on what's actually happening, what the market is doing. Again, there are micro level things that we can always bake this in and make it be a little more realistic, and you mentioned that in the context of North Bethesda, but I do think that this is a good start. So I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Councilmember Fada-Gonzalez.
Good afternoon. This is very exciting, and I will say two things. When I saw these charts, the first thing that came to my mind, I love the fact that that resembles the local community more, so you can understand what's happening exactly in that community. And I do understand the concerns from the council president when you see Bethesda and you think they're taking over everything, but that's the reality, that's what's happening. But the way I'm seeing it, especially talking about the strategies that we need to work on, is that we're about to start working on the growth and infrastructure policy. I can see this as, oh my God, this is like the preamble. This is what's happening now. And now, as we work on that growth policy, these are the strategies that we need to do in order for us to get more housing in all those areas that are not as far as North Bethesda or Bethesda, or what are the targets that we need to do to ensure that we have more of balance in the county and have more housing in White Oak, in Wheaton, in Aspen, and so on and so forth. So that's how I'm seeing it, and that's how I see this document very, very useful. Just to check, it's like a reality check. This was happening, and this is where we should be going. And for that answer, we need to wait into the growth and infrastructure policy. So, and I love the fact that their option that the planning board put together, just because it emphasizes more Thrive 2050 as you put it together. So I thought that was a good thing.
Okay, so colleague, I don't agree, but that's fine. Colleagues would like to keep the factor for the pipeline that's community by community. I will say I think it goes in the opposite direction of housing changes countywide. I mean, that's essentially we're banking on Bethesda driving up the achievement of housing towards our target before 2030 to allow us not to make changes that would otherwise have other communities picking up the slack. So I just want everybody to understand what this actually means in reality of what the numbers are. We're assuming that the most significant housing increase in a particular area over the last 6 years based on unique circumstances will continue for the next 6 years. If that happens, great, but that is a bit of a gamble. I will just reiterate, I'm concerned that this is really a benchmark more than a target. And we're setting ourselves up to miss our own benchmark because we're setting a pretty aggressive standard to assume a continuation of the most robust housing production, infill development housing production that we have seen in recent decades in Montgomery County. So I just think eyes wide open, that's what this means, that's what this will do. If that's where the direction that everybody wants to go, I'm okay with that. My interest is the broader issue here, but this is a detail that matters and that will have an impact, and may have an impact on decisions that we make.
If I could offer two suggestions. First, I just want to actually point out that what we're seeing with this is that the pipeline is our most significant opportunity to be able to achieve a target in 2030. But we haven't yet shown you the 2040 and 2050 our recommendations there. So if you looked at the 2030, 29% of the target is allocated to Bethesda, which is the point you're making, right? So almost a third of the target is put in Bethesda, but that's because of the pipeline that's there. When you look at 2040 and 2050, it goes down to 11% in Bethesda. We're putting more of that in other places.
No, and I agree with that, and I agree with the direction. Let me call on Ms. Dunn, and then we can dispose of this and move on to the 2040, 2050 discussion.
Yeah, the only, good afternoon, thank you. The only thing I would, the committee may want to consider, it gets at the issue of the total impact of a place like Bethesda Chevy Chase with its very large pipeline potential for the next 6 years would be that it doesn't require that allocation component because it's going to meet it. It's way exceeding it. The same would be true for Clarksburg. I can't remember the other one. It was Germantown, I believe. And then I think there were two others that were slightly over. But any place that using the methodology that they've come up with the factors that the committee is comfortable with, that creates this allocation where you added in that pipeline amount, and the pipeline far exceeds what that allocation you're hoping would be. I just don't see any reason to add on to that a further allocation in the pipeline if it continues to perform how it's performed in the past 6 years, which I get is a big if. But given it's doing well, it seems to me the other areas, these other planning areas in the county which aren't able to perform, aren't showing that they're performing as well, could possibly take in that extra allocation rather than tacking it on to Bethesda, Clarksburg, and Germantown. That's just a suggestion.
Councilmember Joanna.
I appreciate it. I mean, just so basically what you're saying is don't include the Part B. I want to have a rational basis for doing that. I get that you're doing well. If this is what we expect to happen, if Part A is what we expect to happen, which is the language here, because we expect it, again, might not, a lot of factors, it's a target, it's not an exact science, all the disclaimers. I don't those 8,000 units have to go somewhere, and if where would they go based on what rational basis and how? I think,
I guess the question is really, what is the dark blue? It is an allocation of additional units that we need to build by 2030 that get dispersed across the county. And if they are the excess of what we expect over the pipeline, and the pipeline in certain areas is so robust, do we again have a rationale for thinking even more should go there? Possibly we do. Maybe that's fine. I would say that if those areas are beyond what the model of looking at our allocation would be without using the pipeline, I mean, Bethesda Chevy Chase is twice as big, just with the pipeline.
Right.
Do we need another 1,000 units?
No, I get it, and I guess the question, and I'll turn to maybe Mr. Sartori or team to answer part of that, is that, again, the 8,000 is really the goal-setting part of it, right? I'm just reframing here. The part A is like what we think you can do based on what you have approved, what the market has already said, people, I want to build here. Like, they've got an approval. It's not like it was pulled out of the air. These are people who have filed for preliminary, to build. And so the question is then, how is the rest of the burden, based on the demographics and of what the market has been bearing, can split this up? And so I think my understanding of Part B is that you allocated that based on the factors that you presented on before, correct?
Yes. I mean,
okay.
Another alternative is you could change the conversion rates. If you can go back to for some of these, if you don't think that Bethesda Chevy Chase is going to achieve the same 78%, we could say, look, for this one, let's mark that down to 65.
Can I make a suggestion based off of that? Because just before, if you're ready to yield.
Well, no, I just hear what he's saying before he makes a suggestion.
Well, on the other side, if we think that North Bethesda is going to achieve more than the 15%, you can bump that up. And that would change some of these.
So I hear what both of you are saying, which I appreciate and Ms. Dunn as well. Here's my suggested compromise, and we'll see where colleagues are. I agree with you and hear you on the piece of we want a basis for this. We don't just want to do what you're suggesting, although I appreciate it's trying to appease my concerns, which I appreciate. You're doing everything we're asking of you, but we want it to be based on something. So my suggestion, my biggest heartburn is looking the past 6 years on Bethesda and assuming that is just going to continue, which is among the more unique things that has ever happened in Montgomery County in housing production, particularly infill housing production. Like, we have not seen that, where it was coming out of a master plan, that it was coming out of a Great Recession, where there was huge amount of liquidity available, an interest environment that we're never going to see again, low construction costs and low inflation. Like, I don't know that we will ever see the exact timing that we saw those last 6 years. So to suggest that the next 6 years are going to look exactly like those 6 years, it seems unrealistic to me. In addition to that, you look at North Bethesda, we're investing huge amounts of energy and effort in North Bethesda. The suggestion that what we saw is almost nothing happening or very little happening, the 15%, where there was excitement of what could happen, but it didn't quite materialize. And that's one of the reasons why it's so low, because it didn't quite materialize to the level that people wanted. So my suggestion to merge the two aspects that you're suggesting is to keep what you're doing, but to spread it out. So to look at a 30-year time horizon and then, look at what is it, you can prorate 30 years to 6 years, but look at the percentages over 30 years, because the last 6 years is really unrealistic. So if you look at what the pipeline, or 25 years, pick a much broader time horizon that would have included upticks and downticks in the economy, just so we have a more realistic picture of what that could look like. And it's based on something, not just we artificially don't like how these numbers turned out, so we're going to change them. I just want to reiterate, by taking the approach that we're taking here, we're assuming things are going to happen that we have to do nothing, and things will just happen.
All right,
so that's what it means. That's what adding the baseline up means.
Jeffrey, instead of going back 6 years, go back 12, go back 15, or what
I would like to go back before the Great Recession, because that's when we saw, and before a new master plan, because what we're seeing is a unique moment where we're quadrupling down on that unique period of basically a decade, less than a decade, like 7 years. So you think about that for a minute. Councilmember Jawanda has a comment.
Yeah, I'll give you filibuster for you, give you more to think about. Again, you mentioned, Mr. Sartori, Director Sartori, that the last 6 years were obviously very unique in the sense that construction costs went up. We had a global pandemic. I mean, it's hard to believe that the global pandemic was started 4 years ago. It's crazy. I was thinking about that the other day. So there was a lot that happened, and you mentioned this in your comments of that worked against building in the pandemic, right? And so I don't think it's like this. I don't know if I agree with the characterization that it's just like it's been easy street and everything's been flowing for the last 6 years. There are some things that were helpful, like the master plan, but again, I think that's why it's not an exact science. And if you look at, I would be the effect of stretching it out, I would assume, would be to lower the amount. So I don't. We'd have to look at it, but I just think, again, if we need to reevaluate these, we can always reevaluate them. And your point about 2040 is super important that we haven't gotten to yet. This section is going to go down to 11%. If we keep talking about Bethesda Chevy Chase, right? You said 11%, and so it's not that they're expecting the little engine that could to produce forever. You're just saying this is what is approved. These are people who have got solid approvals, and and also we expect them to achieve somewhere around here. And also we have unmet needs. So it's not like we're saying other people don't have to step up. And to the point Councilmember Fanny Gonzalez made, we can use this to help encourage them to step up in growth and infrastructure. Like, look, I've been here. I'll take the White Oak area. I'm not going to beat up on them, but we have been, and there's some stuff happening. But we worked so hard. We gave everything that was asked for: the purple areas, the green areas, the yellow, changing all red areas, changing all the taxes, flipping over backwards, giving more money to the people who are trying to develop. We gave away land. I'm just going back 10 years, even before I was here. We have done so much to try to incent development over there, and some stuff is starting to happen. This does not preclude us from working in other areas based on community input for doing stuff like that. So I do think that I would like to stick with using your analysis because I think it's well founded, and it's a basis for us to move forward in a different way in other areas.
I appreciate where you're coming from. I don't understand the aspect of we're going to use this to argue to other communities that they need to produce more. What this is essentially doing is telling other communities that they can produce less, because we assume that if we do nothing, that these trends will continue. I mean, that's
recognizing the market factors that are contributing to what has happened.
I understand that, but I just want to make sure that we're all being clear of what this actually is doing and what this means. We are assuming that stasis, that no change at all, that doing absolutely nothing moving forward will get us to a certain baseline to cut into the targets that we have set forward for 2030. That's what this is doing.
It's not absolutely nothing, though.
It is nothing additional. That is the baseline. That is the starting point. That is the, what in transportation would be considered the no-build alternative. Like, that's what we expect based on current trends. That's exactly what's going to happen.
And we need 8,000 more units.
So what the net impact of that is fewer units that we think are necessary to build countywide, including in Bethesda, but everywhere. So I just want to make sure that we all understand what that means. We're not going to use this to argue we need more housing in other places. What it's essentially saying is we need to do less to get more housing countywide. But if that's the direction that everybody wants to go, and we're going to assume that past performance is going to determine future success, then that is the decision that we are going to make, and we're going to move forward.
Can we go over the 20? I'm sorry. Can we go over the 2040 and 2050?
Okay. So, are you comfortable keeping with what the planning staff is presenting on the allocations?
I am very comfortable, but
okay. Well, we're gonna dispose of this as we talked about. So we're gonna move forward on that. I don't agree with the approach. I'm concerned that we're gonna miss this target, and it's gonna cause other issues. And this is supposed to be a benchmark. where we see where we're happening and we're setting an aggressive baseline, which seems like it could be problematic moving forward, but we'll move forward with that. The other question that we need to dispose of on this topic, and you've already spoken to this, so I'll turn to Councilmember Jawando to see if he has an opinion. There's 3 items, 3 proposals. There's a original planning staff one that was presented to us in July. There's the committee one where we asked them to analyze it, and there's the planning board one. We need to make a decision on that. It's on page 2, bottom of page 2. You'll see original, alternative 1, alternative 2, alternative 3. The alternative 1 was adding the premium factor on top of the original, and then alternative 2 and alternative 3. Do you want to explain those?
Sure. Yeah, alternative 1 and 2 were both what came out of the PHP committee.
It's 1 and 1A, yeah.
Right, and then alternative 3 was the planning boards, and the original was our original recommendation, which is what we're still continuing to recommend in this case.
Okay, so Councilmember Fonda Gonzalez would prefer alternative 3, which was the planning board recommendation, because she thinks it reflects Thrive and really elevates that. I don't want to put words in your mouth, but that's what you said earlier, so just want to reiterate that since we're coming back to this point. Councilmember Jawando, do you have a view on this?
Yeah, I think my view's similar to when we started. I think I was leaning towards 1, but it's not that far from. None of these are super far from each other. So so I'm okay. I'd love to find some consensus on this point. I don't think they're all pretty relevant and pretty close to each other. And once I saw the data that they don't really change the things much, it doesn't. So I think they're all pretty much in the right wheelhouse. Yeah. So.
All right. I'm fine. I'm fine with going with the planning board recommendation. I think it is half aspirational, essentially, and equally, the zone capacity and master plans. I mean, zone residential capacity is really, talking about where we want the growth to be, which I think is a very important factor, and I don't think that should get lost with the macro level, Thrive piece. I think those being equal matter. So I'm comfortable.
Happy to go along with
that. All right, so we'll move forward. We're going to go with the planning board recommendation on that. Again, that doesn't have nearly the impact as the other decision, but I think it's important that we come to an agreement on that. Why don't we move forward to the 2040 and 2050? And I'll just say, I think we should refer to 2030 as the benchmark. These are housing benchmark, and then 2040 and 2050 are housing goals or housing targets, because they are really 2040 and 2050. To the point of the prior conversation, we can debate on what we expect is going to happen if we don't do a whole lot. That's really where we're going to see robust changes in the numbers based on policy decisions that we make. It's unrealistic that in 4 or 5 years moving forward, we're going to see huge changes to the numbers one way or another based on individual policy decisions that we make. So I think it's sets expectations a little bit more reasonably, and based on the prior conversation, I think it even reinforces that point that the goal here is to have a benchmark of what we're expecting is going to happen and where we think the gap is, and to hold ourselves accountable to those things. And then 2040 and 2050, and we'll be the first jurisdiction to do this if we move forward and have this conversation, will be really about setting policy targets. That here's what we think we want to achieve. And we're going to have to make some significant decisions on how we actually get there. That's what we're trying to.
Yeah, I appreciate that framing, and I do not disagree. The one thing, and one of the reasons I asked for this, the age of the approvals, I do think there are some things we can do on the policy in the next 6 years to try to get people to do what they said they're going to do. I mean, it's not going to make major shifts, but I think it's good to look at them all in their appropriate context. This is one set from 2030, and we want to drive towards that. It is a goal. We want to drive towards it. But here's 2050, 2040, and 50 is where we can have impact from a policy perspective in a bigger way. I agree with that 100%.
Yeah, and I appreciate that. I think that I think we're in agreement here. I think it's important. it's not to say that nothing that we do will have an impact. That of course is not the case, but we're not able to dictate in the same way from a planning policy perspective, not just how many units, but where those units are, how transit served they are, what type of activity centers they're near, the broader areas. So that's why saying it's a benchmark, having the gap to hold ourselves accountable, making those policy changes of where we are against our own benchmark, but then setting out on our ambitious 2040, 2050 targets to say, okay, here's what we're gearing towards, and we need to set policy that actually will help us get there in a medium and long range process. So, okay, with that, let me turn it over to planning staff, and you can walk us through the 2040 and 2050 housing targets.
Sure. So we are also recommending that the County Council consider creating housing targets for 2040 and 2050. The 2030 targets, they represent goals only 6 years in the future, and we believe setting targets for 2040 and 2050 will help us meet the long-term vision of housing abundance as envisioned by Thrive. And like the council president just said, the tools and the tactics to achieve the 2040 and the 2050 local housing targets will be different than those that are needed to achieve the 2030 targets. And like the 2030 housing targets, the 2040 and 2050 targets will be based on household growth from the cooperative forecast, round 10. However, unlike the 2030 housing targets, there'll be no additional units that would be added to the 2040 and 2050 goal. Just kind of walking through what that would look like. In 2030, you can see we talked about that, 21,465 units. In 2040, household growth would be around 27,000, 17,000 in 2050, and that would create around 65,000 household units. For the 2040 and 2050 housing targets, we're also recommending that we're going to add a transit quality factor. In Thrive Montgomery 2050, it states appropriate densities will vary, but should be sufficient to support, at a minimum, the efficient provision of transit service along growth corridors. These factors, they tally the number of metro rail, light rail, and bus rapid transit station pairs in each planning area, and they apply a weighted value to each station type. And this is the recommended index factors for 2030, 2040, and 50. And as we said, we don't have to decide that today, but this is our current thinking. As you can see, in 2040 and 2050, we reduced the impact of the Thrive growth map, but we decreased the impact of the household forecast and the zone residential capacity analysis, but we increased the impact of that transit quality score and that activity center score. And we do this because those are tangible things on a map. We know where a transit station is, we know where our activity centers are, and it's achieving that vision that Thrive lays out. And this would be the final result of the housing targets. As you can see that, as Director Sartori mentioned, the 2030 share and the 2040 and 50 shares, they look quite different given the different index allocations and adding that transit quality score and reducing the impact of the Thrive growth map, but also increasing the importance of activity centers. So this is what the housing target looks like by decade. As you can see, per our discussion, the targets, they get a little bit more equal in the 2040 and 2050 decades as compared to the 2030 decade. And then I'm just going to quickly run through the 2030, 2040, and the cumulative map of, you can see, as we've discussed today, the housing targets for 2030, they're pretty significant in the Bethesda Chevy Chase area and Down County. But you also start to see that impact of, transit and the Thrive Growth Corridor map and activity centers in 2040. And then you continue to see the heavy emphasis on that transit quality score in 2050 and on activity centers. And then this is the cumulative map of what it would look like adding the 3 decades.
Councilmember Gonzalez.
This makes me feel way more comfortable, especially since we're putting together the whole picture for 2040 and 2050. It just makes sense when you see this. map that you have in the screen right now. And it's, 6 years go by like this. I mean, Councilmember Jawando, you said we can't believe that the pandemic started 4 years ago. That's crazy. So I think we're making the right decision of sticking with targets that are real. And then I love the fact that you're including transit to shape this map towards the future, because that's what we're talking about in Thrive. That's what we're talking about in every single master plan that we're working on. So I wanted to say that.
Councilmember Joanna?
Agree, and really like the switch to transit, because if we're going to take your air quotes away on Purple Line and build other and build other transit, we want that, we want to incorporate that, and I think this takes the right approach. I really like the transit quality factor. I like the idea, which I know we'll talk about, of reviewing. When I read this, reviewing and updating every 5 years, based on what's actually happening. So I think this is a really good, and I'm pretty much agnostic or happy to go with, I think, the way you laid out the numbers on the couple previous slides of how you're going to factor in. I think those work and are, again, just targets. So thank you.
Appreciate it. Yeah, I'm very excited about this. As we have talked about, this is really the ultimate goal that I always had, of not just seeing where we're benchmarking to 2030, but looking beyond 2030 of how we make policy decisions to avoid where we have been, which is a dire housing shortage, not just in Montgomery County, but statewide and throughout the country. And we get there by planning today for down the road. The policy decisions we make today in master plans and in other macro level policies have impacts that are decades in the making, and we have to start thinking about 2040 and 2050 now from a planning perspective. So I just really appreciate that, and obviously the opportunity for us to think about housing in a way that we want housing, in places that we want housing, with amenities where we want to be near housing, with jobs and transit access and the type of quality of life that we want. That's where we really need 2040 and 2050, because 6 years isn't enough time to both bring new pipeline on and build new communities and new transportation networks. But 2040 and 2050 may be within our grasp, and we need to start planning for those today. That's why they call it planning. Ms. Scavone, did you have something to add?
We have a quick summary of the recommendations.
Okay, why don't you do the quick summary, and then I want to turn to Ms. Dunn to see if she has any feedback or thoughts here, and then we can turn it to colleagues to see where we're at. Obviously, we're heading in the direction of everyone seems excited about this, and I'm pleased that this is where it has moved in this particular direction, but we'll see where we're at the end of this conversation. Mr. Sartori, you just unmuted.
Yep, sorry. I think rather than walk through this, because you've kind of tackled these as we've gone along, just to kind of summarize what we've heard, we're going forward with for 2030 using the pipeline component, and then for the allocation we're using the planning board recommendation, which was alternative 3. Then for 2040, we are going to do 2040 and 2050 using the allocations that we had recommended for the index. Okay.
Let's make sure. I just want to. Let's have a conversation about that. I
Sure.
think the first parts we're definitely on board with. Moving forward, 2040 and 2050, definitely on board with. Let's talk about the allocation. Obviously, I think there's broad support of the heavy focus on transit. I appreciate the focus on Thrive and the interest level there. That's our long-range planning vision for the county, and so that should be layered. Perhaps we get some feedback from Ms. Dunn, if you have any thoughts here on these issues.
Yeah, the only question I had was that and you get to this in one of your recommendations is to update these every 5 years, but the activity centers in Thrive were a point-in-time activity center. They were not aspirational at all. They were not the activity centers we expect to see in our county for the next 10, 15, or 20 years. We had a long debate about that. What does this map really show? We had a lot of angst in the community about that map and whether it showed what was going to happen or what was currently the nature and character of those communities, which was, it was a point in time. And so to use the activity center density score as something that we're going to look at for 2040 or 2050, when those activity scores are like literally, I mean, those activity centers, if you're just going to go back to Thrive every time, that's not the centers that we see in the future. So it's a little, I'm confused.
Sure.
Sure. Why don't we turn to Ms. Scavone or Mr. Sartori, and then I'll turn to Councilmember Jawanda.
We can certainly look at that every 5 years. I think that part of our recommendation is that we look at the data available every 5 years, because we know we're going to have new forecasts, new master plans to add to zone capacity. We can again look at the activity centers too to make sure that they're comprehensive of how we view them at that time. So we can update that.
One other thing that we thought about, because we recognize that that's true, right? So that we've gone through a practice recently where we assigned each area as either a downtown or town center, suburban or industrial or country, right, as part of complete streets, and we're using that in other ways, and that's something that can get updated with every single master plan. We can decide that an area is a downtown or a town center. We could move eventually away from using those dots that were on that map in Thrive and instead use the town centers and downtown area designations that will get updated as we adopt master plans and say this is a downtown, this is a town center, we want to concentrate growth here. It could be captured in that as we update this every 5 years. It's something to think about.
Yeah, I think that I was going to say a chicken or an egg question as we're looking at planning for 25 to 30 years down the road. I mean, these are major questions. I want to dig into that in a minute, but I want to let Councilmember Jawando weigh in here, and then I think we can dig into that issue.
Yeah, I think it's a good initial suggestion. I would be curious to see. I would imagine there's a lot of overlap with those activity centers today, and if you did that analysis. But again, will that be the case? To your point, Ms. Dunn, going forward, who knows? I mean, I know there are some activity centers 40 years ago that aren't today, or so there will be some change. And I think between that, some sort of that analysis combined with the 5 years, I think we'll be able to capture it pretty, or not us, but future councils will be able to capture it.
And just to chime in a little bit on that, so the areas that Director Sartori was referring to were approved last year as part of the pedestrian master plan. They've already been changed. The Fairland and Briggs Cheney plan has updated them, and so each master plan will consider whether it makes sense to update these areas.
Yeah, so the question that I have on that is whether or not we should reflect that here, as opposed to saying every 5 years we're going to look and see what changed and then change it, whether we should reflect this here of identified in the master plans. Is there a way to encapsulate that so that it just automatically updates and picks it up every time we update a master plan? It would seem to me that's a better approach rather than waiting every 5 years for us to go through it. And then if we miss one or there's some type of error, or it happens right after we do that 5 year update, then we have to wait 5 years for it to happen.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of integrates all of our efforts together, right? So we're working on a master plan and we're saying, well, this area should be a downtown. And, well, now we're going to go ahead and make recommendations that make it consistent with that. And, by the way, we're upping, this area's share of our housing target, right? So all the different pieces kind of.
Yeah, and I've always talked about this effort in terms of the housing targets as something that would inform our master plans. And something that, to me, should be at the core of what we do. And so as it currently, the activity center density score, it's really reflected in a static dynamic. Can we make that, can you think through and make that what you're talking about, where it automatically would update? Can we come up with how we define that?
Sure. We could redefine activity center density score to be, town center and downtown, right? And base it off of what exists today, but that would get updated with every
designated town center.
Designated town center and downtown.
And downtown area, which would be through the master plan process.
Exactly. And we would put more emphasis on, more of a weight on the downtowns, less on the town center. So I guess what I'm wondering is, do you want us to do that now or for future consideration? Because we could work on that now. It would cause.
No, I'd like you to do it now. Personally, I think that would be helpful, because my next question was going to be about zone residential capacity score, because of the master plan aspect here and how important I think the master plan process is to how we do land use. I would feel better about the zone residential capacity. While yes, 20 years out is less important than now because some of those master plans will change. Master plans are 20 to 30 year documents. At least that's how they're intended to be. So it would generally encompass the full breadth of 2040 and 2050, at least the newer master plans. So I was going to ask whether or not we should up zone residential capacity score in 2040, and even have it as a 5-factor in 2050. But if we're changing the activity center density score to reflect the changes that we're making in master plans in a more vibrant way, I think that's a better way to approach it than adjusting the zone residential capacity score. Because really, zoned residential capacity, which reflects the master plan and the community by community policy decisions that we're making, where we want housing and what type of amenities we want in and around that housing, that will also be reflected in the designated town center and downtown part. So it would actually be a 35 factor that would be included in that 20 plus the 15, which I think is appropriate. And I think it supports Thrive, but it isn't just Thrive. It's community by community, which is part of the planned implementation of how Thrive is supposed to work. Does that make sense? If you make that change, which I think you should make now.
Yes, we can make that change now to how we've calculated the activity center density score, and we'll change the name of it. I just and what you said made a lot of sense to me, but if we could just make sure we have the numbers correct. So just to keep in mind, that 2030 allocation has been modified because you went with the planning board. So what you would actually see there now, the top line is 35, household forecast is 20, and zoned residential capacity is 35 for 2030. So I think I heard you say was zoned residential capacity score for 2040, bump that up.
No. What I was saying is I originally was going to suggest that, but I don't think we would need to suggest that if we are going to
update
incorporate the changes that we make during the master plan process to designate downtown areas, accordingly. Because I think town center and downtowns are the higher intensity housing development, mixed use development areas that we want, appropriate to scale based on the community that we're in. We're doing that work in the master plan process. So what I was suggesting is, just for the millions watching at home, as Councilmember Joanna would say, the combined aspects of master planning in this calculation for 2040, for instance, would be 35, because 15 for zone residential capacity, which is really a master plan dynamic, and 20 for the new designated town center downtown area where you'd have a different factor. And then what would your thinking be, or do you need more time to determine how differently you would weight a downtown in that area versus a town center?
Yeah, we would probably think a little bit about this. I think what we were doing now is It was we gave twice as much value to what we called a large activity center versus a medium activity center. So we would probably do something similar where the downtown would be twice as much value as a town center. But we could give a little bit more thought to that.
So you get 20 for a downtown area and 10, for instance, in this case.
Right. And then, yes.
And then 30 and 15 for 2050? Or would you do that different? Would you think about that differently? You're going to get back to us.
Yeah,
on this.
we'll have to we'll think about that. And so that actually, yeah.
All right, but I think you have direction. If colleagues agree, I think you're hearing positive. I appreciate the point raised by Ms. Dunn. I was going to ask about the chicken and the egg aspect of it. The point about activity centers being more ethereal and less, fixed over 40 years, 30 years, 25 years, I think is an important point, but I think it's reflected in the master plan aspect.
And so 2 points. One, I want to ask about next steps, but the first is I've been referring to this similar to a 529 plan where a parent will invest in a plan that's set for a particular graduation year, right? And so I'll talk about my own child who's a sophomore in college. When we got a plan that was for a 2021 plan, as you got closer to 2021 and her pending graduation, it got more and more conservative. So if we are updating this automatically, right? But if we update this every 5 years, well, 5 years from now, 2030 is right on us, right? And so we're no longer looking there. We're looking at 2040 and 2050 and maybe beyond. And we're going to look at 2040 differently than we look at it today. We might make it more based on the pipeline that exists 5 years from now. We might, just doing that check-in every 5 years gives us an opportunity to reallocate weights based on how soon those targets are upon us. And then I just had a question about next steps and how you'd like us to proceed. We'll make the modifications that we've heard today. Should we come back to the committee? Do you want us to run those? We can, and then I mean, at a certain point, I think there was probably going to be a resolution. Where do you want us to go from here?
Yeah, I don't know that we need another committee discussion or debate. I think if you could send us a memo on the follow-up so we could get in writing the direction that we have established here.
Okay.
I think then we'll move forward. The goal, as I set forth with colleagues originally, would be for us to move forward at the council with a resolution. So we'll move that forward once we, once we get this from you and make sure that it reflects the conversation that we've had, and then ultimately, I think we'll be in a position to move forward and start discussing with the public what this means and how close we are to our goals, and where we are both in the benchmark and also the long-term aspiration, and what we're prioritizing and how it's impacting our decision-making process. And then my goal is this becomes part of the conversation in every master plan discussion, in every zoning discussion and policy discussion that we have that discusses housing, that we specifically are talking about these issues, and it becomes part of the planning department and the planning board's work and part of this committee and this council's work. Councilmember Joanna.
I think we're just about there. I just want to make sure. I've heard you say a couple times benchmark. I know you want to make it a benchmark. Goals and benchmarks are a little different. I think the way you described the goals, the way you described the 2030 and 2040 goals in the packet or in your presentation, that the tactics and strategies change. They're all goals. Obviously one's a short term, medium and long term, and then what we do to impact those and how much influence we can have all change, and I think we all agree on that. I just want to, I think it's important to say that these are targets, how we achieve them are dramatically different, and we've been talking about that throughout the last couple of hours here, but I do think it's important to say they're all goals. So I just want to make sure we have agreement, since we're not coming back, that I don't, I don't have to send over email, hey, don't call it a benchmark, call it like it's still a goal. So I just wanted to say that.
Yeah, as long as we understand what the differences are of the three different factors, like the 2030, really the focus is to benchmark us against the goals that we have established, the COG housing targets that we have signed on to. 2040 and 2050 are new. These are not related to COG. These are our own. We're the first jurisdiction in the region, I think anywhere that I have heard of, that will have established those. I do think we have to reflect those differently. I think I'm agnostic into how we reflect them differently, but they are, they are different in that sense, that they serve different purposes, and we're at different places in terms of of how they work. But we can work through that moving forward. I don't think we're far apart in terms of what we're discussing, but ultimately we can do a touch point on that and make sure we're all on the same page as we move forward.
Can we just call them index factors for 2030, 2040, 2050, and that's it? That's what the planning folks calls them, right?
Yeah, but that's different from the goals for the housing targets. But
And 2030 is the only one that has the pipeline, which I do think we should
Goals.
have a different name, because that isn't a goal. Like that's what we think is going to happen. Which it's really it's the delta.
Extra is the goal.
It's the delta.
Yeah.
The
blue, dark blue is the goal.
Right, but the goal is already. So I just think it's important to reflect here. We're setting new targets for 2040 and 2050. We already have a target for 2030.
Correct.
We are breaking down by community, and we are basically subtracting out, based on your suggestion, which I think is a helpful suggestion, albeit different approaches to how to implement that suggestion, which is fine, but what to expect in order to come up with the gap. So in 2040 and in 2050, those are new. That's a different thing in that sense, and we're not putting in 2040 and 2050 any factor that says if we do nothing, this is what we would expect, and so this is the gap.
Yeah.
Like really, 2030, the focus is a benchmark to determine what is the gap of what we said we were going to do, and where we think we are right now if we don't make any changes or things stay on the current trajectory that they are.
But we're also saying in the dark blue, this is what we expect everyone to have to do to get us those last 8,000s, which is a target outside of the expected.
It's an allocation of the existing
goal that we adopted.
The existing goal that we already adopted.
And COG's going to, this is going to change over time too, because COG's going to adopt a 2040 goal at some point probably, and
eventually, but maybe in 2030, and then we would have 2060. I mean, the goal is exactly.
Yeah. We're early achievers.
Yeah,
I get it.
So I just think it's important. I don't want 2030 to get too caught up in the 2040 and 2050, and that it seems so aspirational that it's like maybe we hit it and maybe we don't. Right. I think that's the concern that I have, of making sure that we say, okay, here's the benchmark of where we think we are today, based on if you add in the pipeline and what we expect is going to happen, what has already happened, what is the gap, and then we need to have a conversation of how do we address that gap. Like let's be honest about where we actually are, not say we're not building anywhere near the housing we need, or we're building way more than we want or need or whatever. We have an actual number to say, here's what we said we were going to do, here's what we expect is going to happen, and planning area by planning area, here's here's the difference. That is a little bit different than what we're talking about for 2040 and 2050, which are more aspirational, and will inform the policy that we make. But I think we're talking about verbiage here, so
You'll think about it.
yeah,
We'll think about it.
think about it. I don't think we're far apart at all here. I think we're just trying to make sure we come up with language that reflects what we all are saying we want, and I think you'll come up with something, and if we have issues with that or would like it tweaked, we can provide that feedback at the appropriate time. Does that work?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. I just want to reiterate, this was a big ask that this committee made, that I made of the committee and of the planning department, and I'm just very grateful for all the work that has gone into it. I do think this is going to be very significant in terms of guiding our housing policy and our planning and land use and zoning decisions moving forward. And I think it'll be much more data focused, and it'll be much more in tune with our broader policy goals. And that's a testament to a lot of dedication in the planning department among staff and the very thoughtful input from our new planning board that came up with a really good tweak and suggestion that we adopted here. And I think that's important as well. So a very collaborative effort, and just want to express my gratitude and this committee's gratitude for all the work that has gone into it. And with that, we are adjourned.